8 years. And to put it mildly, a distaste for the conduct of the current Israeli government. But within that umbrella, we range from traditional Zionists to non-Zionists. And we're proud of that. A range of views, because we think it's important to be debating the problems, the issues, the alternatives, the solutions among that range and beyond that range. But of course, we're the Jewish Democratic organization, and emphasis on democratic. So that is why we host discussions of this sort, because our hope is that we can provide platforms for important looks at key issues which we feel are not always canvassed fully and openly in our community. And tonight we're tackling, I think, a very important issue. And we have two excellent speakers to take us into the issue. Before we start, let me just say a couple of things. The first is that we are recording, and we've had a lot of requests to make it available, so our intention is to put it online. If you want to ask a question and you're concerned, please just signal it to me or write it down. But we do want to put it online because we think it's important for this to be an open public discussion. The way tonight is going to run is I'm going to ask each of our speakers. Dennis, will you start? To speak for 8 minutes, and I'm going to be strict about those 8 minutes. I will signal to them at 7 minutes, and then break their knees at 8 minutes. And then I will probably start discussion by chucking a few questions at them. And if they wish to speak to each other or throw questions at each other, that's also fine. And then I will open it up for discussion, questions, etc., with the audience. So it would be, we're hoping for a rich discussion with a lot of participation in it, but of course a civil and respectful discussion. We know there's a lot of strong feelings around this issue, but let's do it respectfully. So we have two legal minds here, a former judge and an advocate of the High Court. And I think that's a very good way to start. We know this issue is very relevant, particularly here. We know there's a UCT case currently awaiting judgment, I think, which is a lot of it, not all of it, but a lot of it is around the definitions, the competing definitions, the various definitions of what is anti-Semitism. But I think we come from a wider concern. I know that my concern is that too often a looseness in the definition means that the accusation of anti-Semitism is used to suppress criticism of Israel, even when that criticism is mild and essential and within reasonable limits. So that's really where we start. So I'm going to ask Dennis to kick off.
Yes, I just want to get my clock, but I know that
Well, signal on set.
No, it starts now. And thank you very much, Anton. I want to start by saying I'm interested that this is in the neuroscience movement, because quite a few of my friends, progressive friends, who are the same views as me, said, "Are you absolutely insane to involve yourself in a debate like this? You cannot have a rational debate. It's not possible. So what on earth are you doing?" And I state this up front because I do come here with a great deal of anxiety and trepidation, not because I might be insulted, that's part of my job, for the last 25 years as a judge, it's because it's so hard to engage in this question in a rational, dispassionate way, and I perfectly understand why. But having said that, let me say, I sort of was asked, and I was perfectly happy to do so, to essentially promote the Jerusalem Declaration, precisely because of the issue which Anton has raised, which is the question of when does anti-Semitism, when does criticism of Israel, for example, cross the line into anti-Semitism? And so there are just a couple of preliminary points which I'd like to make. The Constitutional Court, which dealt with this question of the hate speech in the Masuku judgment, which I actually don't have the opportunity time to go into, but perhaps amplify in question time, raised a foundational point when it spoke about this issue of hate speech, and in particular with regard to the argument that what was being propagated here wasn't just criticism of Israel, but beyond. It said, we're actually at the confluence of three fundamental rights: equality, dignity, and freedom of spirit. And that must be right. Now, therefore, my preliminary remark is I associate myself entirely with Stephen Friedman's book, Good Jew, Bad Jew, insofar as his argument is concerned that anti-Semitism has been weaponized in order to stultify criticism of Israel. It seems to me that, for me, that is a terribly problematic matter. And the second point that I want to make is that I do think that within reason, we should be able to accommodate people's freedom of expression, hence my first statement. Now, I don't think there's one definition of anti-Semitism that's going to satisfy us all. I just think that's just impossible. But I think the Jerusalem definition is helpful to me in guiding my own analysis of where we stand. And our analysis of where we stand has become extremely difficult because of what has been happening in the Middle East in general and Israel in particular. Israel's reprehensible conduct in relation to Gaza, and I would think even more reprehensible conduct in relation to the West Bank. Right? And what is going on now makes it incredibly difficult to actually have that sort of rational debate and negotiate the differences between what is absolutely legitimate criticism on the one hand, and on the other hand, it goes over the bridge into something which is ultimately anti-Semitic. So let me just say, for the purposes of this debate, a couple of things about the Jerusalem Declaration. I haven't got time to go into the Holocaust one, because simply in 8 minutes, that's impossible. This is like being asked to do that program just a minute, speak without hesitation, deviation, and repetition for 1 minute on a very complex topic. But here, they say it is racist to centralize or to make sweeping negative generalizations about a given population. What is true of racism in general is true of anti-Semitism in particular. What is particularly classic anti-Semitism is the idea that Jews are linked to the forces of evil. And they go on. And that must be so for me. That is anti-Semitic and manifest should be classified that. It can be manifested in words, visual images, and deeds. But here's the interesting point. They say it is also turning to Israel-Palestine, holding Jews collectively responsible for Israel conduct, or treating Jews simply because they are Jewish as agents of Israel. They regard that as anti-Semitic, and I think that's a compelling argument. Assuming that non-Israeli Jews, simply because they are Jews, are necessarily more loyal to Israel than to their own countries. And here's the interesting point. Requiring people because they are Jewish publicly to condemn Israel or Zionism, for example, at a political meeting. I want to clarify that for 1 second. I want to take you back to the apartheid time, where those of us who were progressive academics, Marxists actually, were essentially also banned from overseas contact because of academic boycott. And how did we resolve that? And how was it resolved with the ANC at the time? It was resolved by actually having a situation where if it was clear by your conduct or statements that you were fundamentally opposed to apartheid, there was no boycott. And I think we must bear that in mind in this particular regard. I have great difficulty in defending people who are going to defend war crimes and genocide. But I think to conflict all Jews, all Israelis in that particular point, I think they are right in the Jerusalem Declaration to say it what they say. Let me finally say, because my time is running out, I think 2 minutes. I have 2 minutes, exactly. Is this, right? What is not anti-Semitic? Supporting the Palestinian demand for justice and the full grant of their political, national, civil, and human rights, as encapsulated in international law. I don't see how that could possibly be anti-Semitic, and I have to say, along with Friedman, that the anti-Zionist, the anti-Semitic label has been used precisely in order to defend them, criticizing or opposing Zionism as a form of nationalism or arguing for the right of constitutional arrangements for Jews and Palestinians in the area between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean. I ask rhetorically, would you classify Martin Buber or Joseph Magnus, the founder of the Hebrew University, as an anti-Semite because they believed in a binational state? Or Hannah Arendt, who argued perceptively that a Jewish nationalist route was only going to get in disaster. You may not have to agree with it, but to suggest that that is anti-Semitic, again, is usually problematic. And then finally, because Anton has warned me that my time is up, and I promised that I would, evidence-based criticism of Israel as a state, any state, should be subject to criticism. And if you believe that Israel has breached international laws, many, the most respected international laws have, that maybe they've committed genocide, certainly crimes against humanity, or war crimes, frankly, I cannot see why you don't have a right to say that. But just as you should have a right to say that Jews are entitled to a state of their own, provided that there's justice for Palestinians, and we can debate what that means, whether in a consociational, binational state, whatever it is, so must it also follow that you should, if you believe in freedom of expression, allow people to make those criticisms without the sneer that they're anti-Semitic. There's much more that can be said, but not in 8 minutes.
Thank you. That was extremely efficient.
Well, it's my clock.
Thank you very much, Mark.
So one way to deal with the does this claim of anti-Semitism limit speech is to think about what the legal framework is with regards to speech. So our Constitution says that you've got a very robust free speech right, but that what is not part of the right is the advocacy of hatred on the grounds of race, gender, ethnicity, and religion, and that constitutes an incitement to cause harm. Now, the advocacy of hatred, so the IRA definition talks about prejudice against Jews that amounts to hatred, that amounts to anti-Semitism. That's only one portion. In order for it to be prohibited or unprotected hate speech, we also have to be inciting harm against the group. So our Constitution allows people to say anti-Semitic things. And I think that's a good thing. I want to know who the hate mongers are. I have been on the record for a long time saying that South Africa doesn't prohibit people waving swastikas. And for a long time, you didn't see swastikas. Now we have entered a heightened state of anti-Semitism that I think everyone will agree has sort of accelerated over the last 2 years, and you're starting to see swastikas being scrawled on graves and on synagogues and many places. And that gives you very important information. It tells you that the temperature has gone up and you need to take serious measures to combat that hatred. Once it boils over beyond the expression of hatred, it becomes a call to action. So once you have people saying, the Jews are despicable vermin and we should exterminate them, then you have good reason to limit that speech. So I think the IRA definition and the Jerusalem Declaration give you some ideas about the parameters of what would constitute anti-Semitism. They both talk about discrimination as well. So, for example, if you say we don't hire Jews, that's going to be a fallback. of antisemitism. And they also talk about direct and indirect. And this is a thing that's recognized in Harber as well. So, for example, the Nelson Mandela Foundation put out a bounty of 150,000 rand for anyone who had ideas on how to combat Christian Zionism. Now, the our definition recognizes that you don't have to target Jews for it to be anti-Semitic. Here, the purported group are Christians. But I think that it's indirectly the case that those Christian Zionists who are standing up for Israel's right to exist care about Jews. And so when you target that group, you say, let's put a bounty on them, there's good reason to think that that's anti-Semitic. Now, of course, the question is it lawful to do something like that? You might think, for example, what our Quality Act does is it prohibits unfair discrimination. So, and not just on the grounds of race, gender, and religion, but also on the grounds of belief. So if you're discriminating against people on the grounds of their belief in Zionism, that is not protected conduct. So, for example, when Rodin refused to play tennis with the girls at King David, the sort of line that's been taken once you sort of see through all the verbiage of scheduling conflict in geography classes and the likes. The claim was, we don't want to play against these girls, not because they're Jews. Some of my best friends are Jews. It's that they're Zionists. Well, that's not allowed by our law. So it's important to understand those sort of legal parameters. You are perfectly entitled to criticize Zionism, and I think it's important that people are able to debate a range of different ideas. But if you're discriminating against the person because of the beliefs, then you breach the law. So I will agree with Dennis that we should be slow to make accusations of anti-Semitism, and that it can have a chilling effect on speech. And I think traditionally the Jewish community has been quite slow. If you sort of look at the data on anti-Semitic events in South Africa, there were generally small number of events, things that were ambiguous. The community would sort of say, let's assume it's not anti-Semitic. And I do think that once you start to call everything anti-Semitism, like if you call everything racism, you denude the power of the word. When it does arise, you need to take it seriously. And I think, in Australia after the Bondi massacre, you had moves to try and censor speech in a way that I think was overly draconian and counterproductive. And I think rather what they should have done was to sort of notice the escalation of anti-Semitic rhetoric and anti-Semitic symbols that were arising and said, this is reason to be on high alert. As far as I understand, CSO in Cape Town sees the situation in Cape Town as high alert, code red, that there's a concern that there are high tension, there could be escalating violence. A number of people asked me whether there would be security at the event tonight. The community here does feel like there's possible threats to people because they are Jews. And I think people feel that they could be under threat because they show support for Israel. And so you want to be able to, let's say, have the free information, let the hate mongers say their things so that you can then work out how to combat it. And you can combat it in a couple of ways. The one is protecting yourself with security, taking sort of measures. I mean, it's one thing to sort of celebrate in our community that we haven't had the acts of violence that you found all around the world. I was speaking to a professor of mine who's moved to Canada, and he said the synagogue that he went to for Purim had been attacked 10 times that month. You had the attack in Manchester, you've had synagogues in Melbourne burned, and our community has avoided that. And I think part of it is because maybe tensions have been high here for longer, and so people have rallied around protection, they've armed themselves. There's a well-functioning CSO. There's a number of different people that are willing to put their bodies on the line in a way that other countries who sort of assume that they were safe and realize that they're not. I also take the view that when things fall outside of the protection of the law, when they amount to genuine acts of hate speech or unlawful discrimination, that it is important to take legal action against those people. One way to quell the fires is to make public examples of those that have stepped outside the law and to hold them to account. So, for example, Thomas Tall, who made quite clearly ethnic claims calling for Jews to be killed, blaming them for acts of pedophilia and behind whatever evil that you can imagine, was held liable for hate speech and was ordered not to engage in certain speech acts, which he then breached. He harassed a number of lawyers, including myself. He wrote me an email and he met the guy that he would kill me and every person that I love. So be careful if you love me. And was then ultimately arrested and incarcerated for breaching the toilet. And I think those sorts of repercussions for unlawful conduct are important to send a signal. And I think that the community has been very good at doing lots of good deeds, spending money in educational causes, and there's now a time to sort of protect the community from those that want it to be annihilated. And so I think funding legal action against people who really have fallen outside the law is an important thing to do. But as I say, you must allow some of the hateful stuff to be said so that you can monitor it, that you can respond in other ways.
Exactly 8 minutes. Okay. Thank you very much.
Can you bill in 8-minute increments?
Sorry?
So does he bill in 8-minute increments?
I'm going to ask both of you a couple of specific examples to try and illustrate these issues. The new mayor of New York has declined to step back from the slogan globalizing intifada and is accused of anti-Semitism by some for that. Do you have a view of that?
Well, there's certain phrases that are meant to be broadcast in 2 different ways. So the one line is, this is just a peaceful movement from the river to the sea. It's just about spreading peace in the region. And the other one is to send a second signal, which is we want the annihilation of the Jews who live there. Globalized intifada, we say, well, what was the intifada? It was either a shuffling off, a sort of resistance, or it was the deliberate killing of civilians through suicide bomb attacks. Globalized intifada is what we're living through right now. Globalized intifada is when you have gunmen on the beach executing people because they are Jews, killing people outside of synagogues. And so, knowing that, Mr. Mamdani refuses to condemn it, I think we can draw the reasonable inference, which is that he either hates Israel or hates Jews. We know that his wife has been in the news for liking a series of posts after October 7, which denied that rapes had occurred, which celebrated the liberation of the Palestinians when they went to kidnap 251 Jews and others. So I think we have, from abductive reasoning, good reason to think that this is not a friend of the Jews.
Well, would I ban it? No. And it's apparently that one of the things, of course, I haven't got you to do, is actually talk about what the law really is. And what the law really is an secrets case, the Constitutional Court. And it's well worth reading because they find one statement to be anti-Semitic and therefore hate speech, and the rest not. Now, what's peculiar about your question to me, I don't like the question that war cries that were like bad, no. And it's curious, isn't it, that a significant proportion of Jews in New York voted for Mr. Mamdani notwithstanding. So that clearly didn't feel particularly agreed by. The question really is, when he uses that term, I suppose the point that Mark's making, which you have to take seriously, does that encourage me to do what happened on Bondi Beach? And I want to tell you that if you look at the judgment here, that's a tricky question to answer because the court emphasizes context. And so, I can well understand why people would say, what does he mean by it? Does he mean globalizing the protest against Israel's oppression of Palestinians? Does he mean globalizing campaigning to ensure that justice is essentially granted to Palestinians? Or is he saying something more? And I have to say, it certainly seems to me that there are enough listeners in New York who would say, like I would, well, that's what he says. But on the other hand, it hasn't exactly indicated that he's particularly anti-Semitic, to the contrary. And I think it's terribly important to just get perspectives before you. I mean, would you have said that globalizing the fight against the apartheid regime, right, was racist against white people? I mean, we're in a fraught situation here, for goodness sake. And once you've got this, I mean, you only have to look what's going on in the West Bank to ask yourself, right? Really, are you going to, how does one respond to this? And if you respond over the top, harmful is not the question. It's whether, in fact, it's hurtful. And you know what's interesting? Not what Mark thinks, not what I think. The court says, what does an objective person think? Someone who, to some extent, from a rules-in position, can actually put themselves in the original position and not try to use up prejudices. So it's an almost impossible question to answer.
Okay, so let me ask another impossible question. It's the impossible questions that hopefully lead us to debate these issues. BDS. There are those who say the BDS campaign is anti-Semitic. But of course, you know, we saw a BDS campaign against South Africa in the 80s. Some said it was anti-white. But we know who said that, and I can't think anyone who wasn't pretty right-wing would argue that it was anti-white. So what is your view on BDS in relation to anti-Semitism? Do you want to go first this time?
Well, let me make 2 points. Firstly, I'm not naive enough to sort of not take Mark's point seriously about anti-Semitism prevailing. Robert Wistrich, in works that are really needed to be read by people, called it the longest hatred. And it is. And I'm not naive about it. And therefore, it's the same complexity I have, so I try to sketch in 8 minutes, about, when does anti-Zionism cross the bridge and become anti-Semitic? Are you entitled to call for a boycott of products in Israel? Of course you're entitled to call for it. Otherwise, how would I, who thought there should be sanctions against South Africa, and which, by the way, were probably more central in bringing down the apartheid regime than anything else, certainly much more than the piddly attempts by contact, notwithstanding what Ronnie Cattles might say. It was effectively the financial sanctions and the defeats of Quita Carnivale by the Cubans and the South African Defence Force, which are material to this. So it's very difficult in South Africa to argue that asking for a boycott because you think that the policy of the government is reprehensible. Right? It's very difficult to argue as in South Africa. No, that's not on. Are there statements by people in BDS that have crossed the line? Absolutely. But is the principle, which is what you're asking, that you can call for a boycott of products from a country with which you disagree? Well, certain people suggest that should be the case with China, precisely for the treatment that they have. And to be honest with you, let me say that whilst I think the war in Iran is an insane action for all sorts of reasons that we can debate, if you said to me, would you join a boycott of products against Iran? I would say, of course I would, because it's such a profoundly present society. So when you start picking your fights and say, well, I like this one, I want that one, you are very slippery slope. For me, provided that the argument is that the boycott is there because it's directed at foundational principles of injustice, I may not like it. As long as I've got the right to protest against it, as long as I can say I disagree with BDS, which I don't, but if I can, I do in part, but I don't, then frankly, I think that should be allowed. Oh, you've got a microphone, certainly.
Yeah, so I again want to draw the distinction between what should be allowed and constitutes anti-Semitism, and I'm of the view that much anti-Semitism must be allowed by the law. So, in other words, I think it should be legal for people to engage in boycott action and to express why they're doing it. Whether it's anti-Semitic is going to be a fact dependent there. I'll give you an example. So Dennis points out, well, one way to sort of try and ascertain whether it's anti-Semitic is to get a broader picture. You know, if you say, as a university, we will not do business with anyone who engages in human rights abuses. Well, so it's going to hit a whole range of countries. You know, so you're maybe not going to do deals with the Chinese because of what they're doing to the Uyghurs. You know, you're not going to do deals with people in Nigeria because of what they're doing to the Christians. And then there'll be some debate about what is wrong. But if you, let's say as UCT, for example, create an academic boycott against Israelis, and you pretend that it's only against people who don't service the idea, knowing that it's society as conscription, and you don't reference any universal values, but you single out that state, I'm inclined to think that you're doing it because you hate the one Jewish state, and you think that it should be treated differently from others. And I think both definitions are going to say that probably gives an indication that you're an Antisemite. And also, the university is different from other actors. Organ of state. In our constitution, organs of state have an obligation to uphold rights in the Bill of Rights. Our constitution is unique, including in the free speech right the right to academic freedom. So when you prohibit your academics from being able to do research collaborations with others on the grounds of their ethnicity. So for example, if you work in neuroscience and in your network of researchers there has to be someone who's serving the idea, you now are not allowed to engage in that research, even if it's entirely tangential. That's not just sort of bad idea for the university, but it's also a breach of your constitutional obligations. But for an individual who says, you know, I don't want to buy Israeli tomatoes, I don't want to buy Chinese cars, speak freely, you're entitled to do that.
Can I just say something about the academic boycott, Anton? And it's a personal reflection. During the 1980s, I think it's fair to say that only myself and Raymond Sutner analysed the law from the Marxist position. And we were invited I was invited to go to the first critical legal studies conference held at Kent when the British academics started the critical legal studies movement. I was invited to go on the day that I was supposed to get played. I was phoned by the organisers who said, no South Africans allowed, whichever is starting, you can't come. And well, my ticket was paid for, so I said, okay, I'll have a good week in Harber. I got phoned up by my collaborator, who was Robert Fine, who was very long, profound work on Marxism, to say, no, we had a meeting last night. You know, you've got to come. They rescinded on the decision. And it's usually embarrassing because I didn't really know. In my 30s, totally a senior academic, didn't want to be the focus of attention. But the point that was made by a number of people was, how the hell can we, sitting in the comfort of our British homes, single out some poor bastard who's actually taking risks by opposing the apartheid regime, and we say we're not prepared to talk to you? And that's why I think an absolute academic boycott always for me has been an abomination. I know Israeli academics that I've collaborated with. Some of the best work that I've ever done has been co-authored with Israeli academics at Tel Aviv University. And they have the same view as I. If they heard me speak tonight, they'd say you're probably too moderate. And just boycott them. It's just an outrage. It's an absolute outrage. Because we should be trying to support people who essentially are fighting for justice in their countries. And for us to simply say, well, all Israelis are therefore bad. Well, I'm afraid that's where I'm inclined, Mark, to come to the conclusion that is so unjustifiable that it gets into the anti-Semitic domain. And I just wanted to make that point. And I think we need to think this seriously. If we are committed to actually not just blowing off our trumpets and thinking we're doing a wonderful thing in our own egos, and we want to actually contribute in the little way we can to actually promoting people who's standing up in difficult circumstances, the last thing we should be doing is tell them we're not prepared to speak to you.
anything arising from what you said that you'd like to ask each other about?
You're very welcome to stop if you want more. It's unusual for judges to be asked questions.
Yeah.
Anyway, carry on.
I'm interested to know what you think the major threats to Jews are in South Africa and globally, and what you think good methods are to combat genuine anti-Semitism.
It's exactly so. Let me say something about us here. I'm not sure about Johannesburg. I can talk about Cape Town. The other night, I happen to be believe it or not, and probably, the one person who thinks this in the shoe, but I do go to Marine Road Shoe on a Friday night. And I'll tell you why I go there. Because I love Chazon. Part of my tradition. Part of who I am. And I love listening to Cantor Dropping. So I go every Friday night. I have to put up with the nonsense that rabbi speaks, but it's a good time to have a good night short. And last week, 10 days ago, I took 2 English friends of ours. Provided I had them for dinner, but beforehand, I took them to shore. And they were utterly amazed by how relaxed the security was. They said, but we only saw 2 or 3 CSO people and that was it. And I said, well, frankly, there may well be statements about security, etc. And I have discussed that with my erstwhile employee, who happens to be the Minister of Police at the moment, Kashalia. And actually, we're not really. We've been, in touch with to date, we've actually been pretty lucky. And there's a bit of schadenfreude on my part about all these Australians who come back from South African Australians who come back and tell me how terrible it is. And I'm not celebrating what happened to them, but I do think, well, thank you very much. We're actually in a better position than you are as Jews. And by the way, there's now a serious movement that Australia is no longer a place for Jews. I can understand why. Do I feel in South Africa that there's not a place for me? No, I've never felt that. I want to tell you something. I have never felt any anti-Semitism on bench in my 25 years. And they all know I'm Jewish. I use Yiddish expressions from time to time. I'm probably the only judge that has cited the Talmud in the judgments. And I have never, ever felt that. So I have to say, I'm not naive enough to say there aren't threats. But I think to a large degree they're over-edited and over-exaggerated. And I want to say one final thing. I think that the reaction of the established Jewish community to what has been going on at the moment is absolutely appalling. I have not heard one word from any Orthodox rabbi in this country showing any expression of sadness or regret that little children were killed in Gaza. If you believe, I've heard the Orthodox chief rabbi, certainly not my chief rabbi, right? I've heard him go on and on. So when you talk about the fact that we're all created in the image of God, are Palestinians not created in the image of God? Can you not just, in the goodness sake, say this is an absolute tragedy? And the fact, and Rabbi Alexander and I, apropos King David and Herzliya, Rabbi Alexander, a very fine man, and sadly is leaving our town, which I regret greatly. We both written to the Jewish Report, criticizing the right-wing Zionism that's propagated in Jewish schools. So I want to say something about that. I want to say, we need to equip our children to deal with all of these particular complexities that the Jews are speaking to. And I think when you trot out a sort of Bibi Netanyahu equation that that's what Zionism is, you do no favors for the Jewish community in South Africa. We need to understand that there's a Jewish tradition here which embraces the Constitution in full and should be embracing as best we can the diversity of our society. And we live in a town where there are a vast majority, but far more significant group of Muslims than us. And if we can't reach out to them, then frankly, I'm really troubled by that. Now, should they reach out to us? Well, I understand their difficulty, but I think we need to be making efforts both ways. And that also means showing empathy for the greater contextual situation in which we find ourselves.
Thank you very much. But as they say in Poland, they're about to contradict you with all due respect.
That sounds like my
Honorable Jack. I believe that there is a constitutional court judge who quoted the Talmud, Judge Kampepe. I believe so.
That is your good post.
So my point really is that you're in good company.
But in competition law, it's most unusual.
Do I have any questions or comments or indications? One there and one there and one there and one there. Can I ask you to keep it short? And then I'll.
Can you take the microphone?
How do you want to do this?
I'm going to give you a mic.
Microphone.
Can you pass that back
Awesome.
over there and then you?
And sorry,
the okay, thank you. The people in Joburg are saying, please hold the mic clearly so they can hear you there.
Hello, Joe.
Joe. Do you want to introduce yourself if you wish?
My name is David Anton, and I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Free Market Foundation. My organization is very privileged to work with Advocate Oppenheimer on a number of our public interest litigation matters, one of which was the Musuku judgment. So Mark represents us, our rule of law project. It intervenes to uphold and maintain the rule of law where it views it as being in breach. So, Mark, one of my concerns about hate speech legislation is that it can be very easily influenced by the climate of public opinion, and that judges or whoever else is interpreting this legislation can use it to act in a very discretionary manner against speech they just don't like. So my question is, do you think that we would have had the same judgment if Musuku was heard today, given what has transpired over the last couple of years since October 7th?
Thank you.
That's a great question.
Should we do one at a time?
Yes, I think so. Let's keep it short.
Yes, I think that's an excellent point to make. And I think what we see reflected in a lot of our hate speech jurisprudence, having argued many of the big matters, sort of Musuku and Kolani intersect with each other, is that once we officially reached consensus on what the law was, it then got disobeyed afterwards. So we have a very interesting example of this, that the US ambassador gave a speech a couple of days ago where he said, it's quite obvious to me that the chant "kill the word" amongst the hate speech. And he disagrees with what our courts have found. And if you look at the sort of reasoning applied in that case, what the High Court did was first to I ran the "kill the word" case. The High Court said that actually "kill the word" is really aimed at the ANC governments and their failures in ban reform. This was an astonishing thing to hear for myself and for the EFF because no one had argued this. It was one of the most bizarre contortions. The Social Research Foundation gathered some data to try and find out what do people think the song amounts to. That was one of the options. It was the one that was ranked the lowest. The one ranked the highest was that this is a literal call to kill people on the basis of their Afrikaans. And that view was echoed by members of the EFF. Mr. Malema himself had said, the song is an instruction to soldiers to go out and to kill. When I think of a farmer, I think of a white person. When the time is right, we'll bomb Union buildings. We must embrace violence because we're in a revolution. These sorts of things were said and totally ignored by the judge. Edwin Cameron, a retired Constitutional Court judge, said he finds it very difficult to explain to foreign visitors to South Africa why kill the word not hate speech, but public displays the whole South African flag are hate speech. So it does appear to be the case that depending on the judge's other views, that they will decide basically based on their gut, do I like this or not, and then contort some way into an outcome. And that is anathema to the rule of law, which is why the rule of law project was present in Musuku, where there was a concern that the SCA found that that speech didn't amount to anti-Semitism, to say, well, can't have different rules for Jews, can't have different rules for Afrikaners either. Whatever rule you come up with is applied equally, and that obedience to the rule of law is absolutely vital.
Thank you.
I think, can I just say, well, the Musuku case, of course, one of the advantages of the Constitutional Court had there who's had some of the finest silks in South Africa arguing that. And then my friend Gilbert Marcus is probably the leading silk in this area. He was one of the council part of the MIT. And it's a very complex question because, you know, when it comes to things like the hate speech case, the Kill the Boer case, I found that judgment incomprehensible. I think it's wrong. I'm not the ambassador, thank God, so I can say it. I mean, you know, I think the ambassador got a bloody chutzpah, bearing in mind the court that he, from the country that he's in, where the Supreme Court of the United States of America looked like a bunch of sort of Trump supporters in robes. But that judgment was wrong, in my view, legally. So the question which you ask me is what would happen now? You know, of course, this judgment was not that long ago, listening. So one would hope that the precedent would help. But there have been curious judgments in relation to this. I remember very distinctly the Constitutional Court judgment in which Justice Cameron and Froneman dissented about an interim interdict restraining Pretoria from changing the names. Right? And the majority judge said those old apartheid names have to be changed. Cameron and Froneman also, he said, in an interim judgment, we couldn't. And I remember discussing this with Gilbert, and I didn't want to say it was him, so I'm just going to say one of us took the view that well, even in an interim way, if you were Jewish and you were living in Hitler Boulevard, would you be prepared, wouldn't that be hurtful on a day-by-day basis? And yet, two judges, probably the two best in the Constitutional Court at the time, didn't go that way. So these are complex questions. I would hope that if we had a case now, the Constitutional Court would follow, in broad terms, the Lesotho precedent.
Thank you.
I just want to make the point that thank you. It seems to be that we're discussing two things here. One is what is anti-Semitism, and the other is what is actionable at law, what statements are against the law. And the two are very different. At a dinner party, someone can say, I dislike Jews. A clear anti-Semitic statement is not actionable unless it's followed by some sort of attempt to promote harm or killing Jews. So that's just the first observation. Anti-Semitism in itself is all around us. Be it at a club or over a braai, somebody said, oh, he's such a effing Jew. But, you know, each have a decision, do we respond? Do we say, hey, that's not right? But the issue of what is actionable is very different from what is anti-Semitism. And the second thing on a lighter note, I'm very disappointed with this evening. I had expected to be there's some difference of opinion between the two speakers, but so far you have been, as you lawyers say, ad idem the whole time. Are there differences, and would you care to comment on that?
I think it's the second issue. I think let's try and find where you differ.
Yes, I think the things off the topic around what's actionable and what's anti-Semitic around the conduct of Israel, for example, we are going to disagree. We may have different views about what kind of education you should have in schools. I like the idea of a variety of different things. I mean, I run a philosophy discussion show where we will have on basically anyone who's an academic philosopher, regardless of the content of their views. So, you know, we've had on a guy called Raj Malwani, who's a good friend, who thinks, for example, that you should have a one-state solution. And you know, I thoroughly disagree with the idea of a one-state solution. It's one of those sort of posh-shaped things where you find ultra-orthodox people in favor of a one-state solution, as are people on the left. Yeah. So I think having a discussion is important. I also strongly take the view that modeling civil disagreements is really important. You know, we're not here playing tables with each other. I think disagreement is useful because I know what's true. You know, sometimes people will change their minds. Maybe not in the moment, but afterwards they'll sit and reflect and say, I actually thought about that, that's good for you. And that's important. So my suspicion is that there are many things that we agree on. It seems we both agree that some anti-Zionism really is anti-Semitism. That there are dangers, the extent of those dangers and what to do about them, I think it's a complicated question, and I think we are fortunate, and sometimes it's sort of it's hard to know how many barriers have been put up to keep things safe, because the incident doesn't happen, but they're intercepted before we know it, so. But I imagine that we can find something to fight about. I like fighting, but I like to do it civilly.
Sorry, let me just make one point about the first point you made. The court said, and I agree, there's a difference between anti-Semitism in the broad sense of the word and, what the Equality Act or the Constitution says. But it is interesting that it said that they were particularly emphasizing the word hurtful. It's too wide. We hurt each other with speech, but that's fine. You may hurt me because you suggested that I'm not different from Mark, it's irrelevant. The point about this.
Speak to the mic.
Probably constitutes a brutal psychological harm that severely undermines the dignity of the targeted group as well as physical harm. And so that's a pretty accurate thing for me, Jonathan, because I still teach at university. This being probably my last year, my 50th year, which is quite ridiculous. But the point about it is Jewish students, of which there are far fewer at UCT, some of them do think that they've been psychologically, that they can't say what they want to for fear of psychological harm. And it troubles me greatly. So when Marx says we differ, but not to the extent that we throw chairs at each other, my God, do I support that position. I wish the university would. Now, on your second point, I think the difference is that I'm probably taking a more extreme position of what, in fact, let's say, is anti-Zionist and not anti-Semitic. Let me give you an example, and I'm going to give it from the International Holocaust. The International Holocaust definition would say that calling Israel a colonial or racist endeavor is anti-Semitic. Well, let me just say this about that. I can just find my quote. Yes. This is what somebody said many years ago. Every native population in the world resists colonialists as long as it has the slightest hope of being able to rid itself of the danger of being colonized. That is what the Arabs in Palestine are doing, and what they will persist in doing as long as there remains a solitary spark of hope that they'll be able to prevent the transformation of Palestine into the land of Israel. The speaker was talking about the colonization process. Do you know who the speaker was? Vladimir Jabotinsky. Now, you wouldn't regard him as an anti-Semite, would you? So what I'm trying to say is I think there are differences. I am prepared to accept that if you have a debate with me about whether it's a racist state or colonial state, I say, fine, I'm happy to have that debate. That's a bloody debate we had about South Africa in the 1980s. Anybody who used to read Harold Baldwin and Martin Lagasse will know that we had these kind of Talmudic debates about whether South Africa was an internal colonial state or not. And the bottom line is, I think where I do differ, probably for Mark, I am prepared to be a lot wider in my conception of what I think is legitimate debate and so on. But I tell you why it's difficult to have a huge argument here. It's because it's so difficult to precisely define the pathology. Right? It's almost like you know it when you see it. And I'm trying my best to try to give guidelines to this. But I have great difficulty in being able to give you the kind of position so that we would have a massive argument about whether X or Y is the case, because context matters. I mean, you have all sorts of Jewish humor. If it was Jewish humor, if it was told by a non-Jew, we say it's anti-Semitic. If it's a Jew, it's hilarious, right? And that's all about context. So that's why I'm saying I have some difficulty in that. So, yeah, shall I keep it? That's yours.
We have a question from Johannesburg. Can I ask Joburg to come in before we take another one here?
This is a comment about Anton's earlier questions. And I agree fully with Dennis Davis when he says that boycotting critical dissident Israeli academics is idiotic politically. But what is anti-Semitic about it? We have to separate political criticism from definitions that have nothing to do with it. You can agree or disagree whether you want to boycott academics, but what's anti-Semitic about the action itself? The same thing about globalize the Intifada. You can agree or disagree about the wisdom of armed struggle. And intifada doesn't mean just armed struggle, but it's part of that range of tactics that have been used by Palestinians. But even if you disagree with armed struggle and regard it as immoral and violation of human rights, it's not clear what is specifically anti-Semitic about using this particular strategy. So I think we are conflating here a principled opposition to anti-Semitism, which everyone shares, and debate about political strategies in which one can have different opinion and can condemn some strategies without labeling them as anti-Semitic or anti-Zionist or whatever. It's a different debate.
I have no idea what he's saying. But it tell me what he was saying.
And my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I didn't hear the first bit. And correct me if I'm getting it wrong, Ryan. You're saying that the globalizing divide is a question, the criticism is of a political strategy, which may or may not include armed struggle. And we're confusing that with a notion of anti-Semitism. The issue is not anti-Semitism, it's whether you think the political strategy of the Intifada is acceptable.
Well, I thought I answered that.
Okay.
Well, I'm not going to say a word, but it's after it.
Yeah, so I think it's important to draw the distinction about whether certain methodologies are inherently anti-Semitic. If you look at the Jerusalem Declaration, it says the following things are on their face or prima facie not anti-Semitic. They give examples of EDS. And then I think, but that doesn't say that it's never anti-Semitic or that it's a good idea as a strategy. FAQ haven't been said, but it's available. You sort of see that you might think these are illegitimate strategies, bad ideas, but not necessarily anti-Semitic. As a pastor, like we want to know, like, is it necessarily the case? And one way to find out is to sort of engage with a person. So if you say, well, do you think that who should be allowed to engage in armed resistance? And if they say, well, only the Palestinians against Jews, and then you have some reason to think, well, okay, maybe you're motivated by hatred of Jews. If you think, well, under the following generic universal condition, I think it's okay to take up arms. Then you can sort of say, okay, well, you've applied it to a range of cases. I do think it's important to engage in a bit of a dialectic with someone to try and understand. I mean, here's what I sort of find baffling about Islam is the claim of being the moral champions who are going on to the ICJ because we care about human suffering and the violation of human rights. But when the now estimate is between 30 and 40,000 people are massacred by the Iranian regime, which should ring, sort of loudly for South Africans. You think about the massacre in Sharpeville, where 69 people were killed by the state, and we recognize that in a national holiday every year, that you would have expected the South African government to say something about these people being murdered for merely protesting, their pernicious government. But when they say nothing, then I think that the failure to act on the one shows me that the reason why you went to the ICJ is either because you hate Jews, or, as everyone has been saying for quite a while, you're in league with the Iranian regime because you failed to condemn them, but that you do their bidding in the ICJ. So, we have a principle in law about deductive evidence and inductive, and there's a thing called reasoning from the best evidence. And so, you can sort of look at the surrounding circumstances and come to some kind of conclusion.
You've got to wish now.
Yeah.
It's not your time.
The ICJ case, it's just stopped there. To a large degree, the architecture that was John Dugard, who's my colleague, my friend, and was my predecessor at the Center for Applied Legal Studies, to suggest that he's an anti-Semite. I'm not suggesting Martin, but people do. That's outrageous. In fact, when I went to Johannesburg to take over the Center for Applied Legal Studies from him, and I had a lot of social engagement, I thought he was Jewish because all his friends were. John Dugard was appalled by what was going on the West Bank and in Gaza when he became a special rapporteur. And that's why, to a large degree, he's had that commitment ever since, and it's a perfectly consistent one. I think that going off to the ICJ, and many, many international lawyers, in fact, Philippe Sands said the other day that Raphael Lemkin, who was the originator of the genocide conception, eventually the genocide convention, would unquestionably have thought that Israel's conduct in Gaza was genocide. I think you can't argue that, oh well, that on its own is anti-Semitic. But where Mark has a point, and I have to agree, is it does trouble me that people say absolutely nothing about 30, 40,000 people being massacred in Iran. I find that incredibly difficult to get my head around. I think, there has to be some moral consistency. Now, I understand one thing, that when South Africa was an apartheid state, there were many other atrocious regimes, and in fact, the National Party's general ploy was, why don't you moan about Uganda with Idi Amin? We're not as bad as him. But that was their line. I don't think we should be speaking in a binary fashion. I find it extremely difficult to understand how you can be so passionate about one issue and say that people who are slaughtered, who may be different people, somehow that's okay. It can't be it. And I do feel that on that particular point. Now, are these people anti-Semitic? I just don't know because it's hard to work it out. But I have to say, it's a question that I ask continuously of myself and of them. Why is morality as such just located in one issue? Does that mean that you should? But my difference is, I think that it's fine for South Africa have taken the case to ICJ. I perfectly understand the judgment of the ICJ, and I've spoken about this often at the preliminary stage. We can differ about it, but I understand that. But even though I do understand, and I think that was right, that doesn't in fact distill my disquiet from the fact that people say nothing about 30 or 40,000 people being brutally murdered in that way. It just doesn't make sense.
I hear that, but it seems to me one is a question about consistency and possible hypocrisy. I'm not sure how you get from that to anti-Semitism.
That's why I was very cautious about saying. I'm not saying it's necessarily anti-Semitic, but I'm prepared. But it's questions I want to ask those people.
Right.
And I think they're fair questions to ask people, and I think Mark's right to raise issues. That's all I'm saying.
Right. We've got one there, and sure. And you came in earlier, so you'll be after that. And then two be next to each other. So let's take one of you, and then we'll go. Over there, yes.
Thank you. Question to the both of you. Sitting as the minority in this room, as I often am in rooms in Cape Town, I sit here, quite one comment. 90% of the country doesn't care about this conversation. They're too concerned about how to get home to Kailicha and how to feed their kids. The other 10% is engaged in this debate. What do you say to charges that anti-Semitism is raised above all other forms of racism as a way of weaponizing it?
I'm not sure that I understand the question properly. If you, the last part, you're saying is anti-Semitism a kind of worse form of hatred than anywhere else? Is that what you're saying?
That used to be the worst form.
No, I don't think it is. I think, but we should be as wary and as opposed to anti-Semitism as we are to homophobia and to racism. Right? For me, they all stand on a par, and they must stand on a par. Because if you follow and by the way, I think they stand on a par from the very tradition which has influenced the Jewish tradition. Because the Jewish tradition believes in the dignity of individual. How could I possibly suggest that because you hate me because I'm a Jew, right, counts for more than if I hate you because you're black? That would be an absurd argument. And I want to just say that, from my perspective, one of the greatnesses of our South African Constitution was in fact to ensure that there were a whole lot of categories which we find equally reprehensible. So, but obviously the debate tonight is about anti-Semitism. I'm more than happy to engage with you about racism, of which we've all had, sadly, very much experience. But it's only because the focus on that, it should not be misconstrued in any way to suggest we've got a greater claim to sympathy than people who hate black people or gay people, lesbian people, LGBT community. Sorry,
I think there's a greater truth that you get at, which is the amount of attention that Israel gets in the newspaper doesn't bear any resemblance to the size of the country or the number of people who live there. And as a South African, as you can say, the amount of suffering in South Africa is incredibly alarming. We have one of the highest unemployment rates in the world. You have, I think, more people who starve to death in South Africa, more children who starve to death in South Africa than in Gaza. But you would think that this was the South African issue. And so I think that the attention is on this issue is strange, given what our country is like, and given the sort of immense suffering. So I think you're right to raise that concern.
That's the camera.
And the qualification is that that's true under the apartheid era as well. The world doesn't have an attention span to deal with more than perhaps one conflict at a time. I'm afraid, do I think that's right? Of course I don't. But that's just the reality of life.
Okay.
I'm going to use the chair to say that I'm not sure it's true to say that anti-Semitism gets more attention than the state of our society. I'm just not sure that's true.
I agree with you.
And secondly, I mean, it may reflect, me, but it seems to me that the events in Gaza and the West Bank and the conflict there, because of the particular history that gives rise to it, is an absolutely key global moral issue in our generation. So I don't see why we have to explain any concerns or engage or worry or raising it.
But there is one aspect, Anton,
Yeah.
one aspect, which your friend pointed out. If we all could show 10% of the passion that we show about Gaza to people dying on the townships each and every day, I can tell you we'll probably stop. When children get shot because their mothers are taking them across the road in gang violence, and we don't show the same level of outrage, I'm troubled by that. I do not want to live in a society which essentially only co-focuses on Gaza and does not pay requisite attention to the suffering literally 5 miles down the road.
I can't contradict you on that. But go ahead.
This is a question for
I don't think your mic's on.
is this on now?
Yes.
Okay. Dennis, we're speaking about academic boycotts. You raised the issue that there are academics in Israel who are as committed to changing the situation there, and that it would be ludicrous. I think that's what you said, to not engage with them and give them support where they probably in the minority where they are. to engage with, to make this distinction between the academics you want to engage with because of their stance, makes that qualitative decision. And wouldn't a university open itself up to criticism if they were to start choosing, well, we think this one is appropriate, critical enough, and others not. So it's a bit of a slippery slope problem, and that's why the apartheid boycott, where South Africa was a pariah state, applied across the board. And you probably know about the Connors Cruiser Bryan affair that hit UCT, right? So that was a principal stance, and there was a cultural boycott and academic boycott of South Africa.
No, but you see, that's the point. First, yes, I was involved in the Connor Cruiser Bryan. I need to defend a whole other students, so I know all about what you're talking about. But no, you're wrong. And that's the problem. We have social media. It's absolutely true that for quite a long time there was a blanket boycott, but precisely because it was becoming a situation that a whole range of progressive elements within South Africa were not engaging, was that the ANC accepted, and in fact there was a draft document about what was required in order that you could be embraced by the international community. It was not, it was blanket until a period, and then the realization that the blanket boycott was counterproductive. You know what the blanket boycott did? It allowed a whole bunch of right-wing lunatics to come into South Africa who didn't care about the academic boycott, and our students were then exposed to all of those views, and nobody else. And so there was a view that in fact we had to change it, and it was changed. And history shows that from around about 87, 88, there was, and I know for a fact, that one of the people who was involved in the drafting of the protocol was Professor Mike Morris. And we followed it. So no, I'm sorry, you're utterly wrong historically. And I think the same, and is it that difficult? No, it's not that difficult to work out. Those are people whose work, whose scholarship, whose statements are such that you can't lump them in the same bunch as a whole bunch of people supporting Netanyahu or the IDF, as the case may be. I'm sorry. It upsets me that we've forgotten our own history.
I'll just say something else on that topic, which is there's immense value in being able to hear from people that you disagree with. So if you look at the kinds of content around Israel that's available to students on campus, it's one-way traffic. And I don't think that that's particularly useful. I think one of the problems with it as well is that people who are in an intellectual echo chamber, once they encounter someone who holds a different view, they haven't built up any of the robust argumentative skills that would be necessary to confront that view. And so often they then don't engage in intellectual argument, they engage in hysterics or other kinds of sort of shutting down dialogue behavior. I think there's a lot of value in a variety of ideas, but I think like intellectual diversity is one of those things that's absolutely important to have on the campus. And I wouldn't want to do an ideological purity test on who comes out. So I think hearing from people who you think are the bad guys is a good idea. You got a good chance to listen to that person, confront them, and raise counter views. I mean, I imagine that there are many non-Israelis who are very strong believers in the Netanyahu government, and there are many, Israelis who hate Netanyahu. You can get a variety of those on the drive. So being able to hear all of them, I think, is quite useful. And also, we live in a world where you can access those views online. So trying to create this sort of funny bubble in university will just create a distortion anyway, rather than put people forward a counter view.
Dennis, you're shaking your head.
Yes, because I think there are differences. I mean, if you're basically complicit in, you're rationalizing or justifying the oppression of Palestinians or the conduct of Israel on the West Bank, to take two, or that, you defend the idea of bombing of children in Gaza. Sorry, I don't think you then fall within an established community of scholars that I don't engage with. And I think it's perfectly permissible to say, sorry, this idea that, do I really have to listen to Google in order to understand what that is? No, I don't. And I'm sorry, yes, I believe in freedom of speech, but I'm not a free speech fundamentalist. And that was a debate we had, by the way, right about the time concrete of right, but that's an entirely different. All I want to say is, I think there's a category that I want to support because my political project is I want to encourage the kind of debate in Israel that kind we're having now, and I want to support those people who are courageous enough to do that, and I don't want to discriminate against them.
I'm going to add one thing, which is in response to Mark, which is that we have to face up to an unfortunate reality, which is by what we've seen in Washington, because of Trump embracing all sorts of anti-Semites, is that it's been brought into the mainstream of American debate. So views that were completely unacceptable a few years ago are in the mainstream of the American debate, and I think that's deeply worrying. So I don't think we just say, "Oh, let's have it. It's great to have all the possible views." I think you have to see the danger in that. Anyway, no, the fellow at the back was next. No, yes, the fellow at the back. No, sorry, the man in the black first, and then one of those women over there. So what I'm going to do now, because we are running out of time, and Basil here, is let's take those three, and then ask for responses, and then maybe we'll take one more round after that. And I have seen you for that. Go ahead. Keep it short, please.
We've spoken a bit about how you believe the academic boycott had anti-Semitic motivations. I was wondering, the change from the IHRA definition to the Jerusalem definition of anti-Semitism, do you think that there might be anti-Semitic motivations behind that?
I didn't say that the academic boycott was sourced in anti-Semitism. I just thought it was a particularly poor political ploy. It was poor politics. Did I think, however, that the notion that if you say all Israelis are the same and they all need to be dealt with in the same way, then you are getting into classifying people on the basis of identity. And if you do that, yes, then you are running into the problems of, in this case, anti-Semitic, as you would be if you were suggesting that all black people are the same, and therefore you're going to classify them in the same way. The whole bloody point is that we suffered a form of identity politics, both on the right and on the left, that for old-fashioned Marxists like me has been an utter tragedy. Look where the world is today as a result of that. There's no progressive politics in the world any longer. Because because I'd like to know where it is. And the answer is we've got to get beyond that notion of identity. And so, no, I'm not suggesting for one moment that those people who want an academic boycott are anti-Semitic. I just think by excluding everybody in a blanket way, it's an incredibly stupid form of politics. And then I'll go further to ask people, why are you not prepared to acknowledge that there may be Israelis who think the same way as you or differently, which is fair enough in circumstances where we can have a civilized debate about certain issues, because fundamentally we do have a similar moral vision of the world. That's what I was saying.
So I did not what I said I would do. So we're going to take that one, and we're going to take Basil, and we're going to take that lady over there.
Yes, because she's had a hand up all the time.
She has. And take those three, and then ask you to respond.
It's like my cup of tea, right?
Good evening. Good evening. Thank you very much for this very interesting talk this evening, and to all of you for sharing your views, and especially to Dennis. Thank you so much for championing the Jerusalem Declaration as well as Hazonis, which is nice to hear as well. As someone who has thrown a item of furniture before, I'm going to do my best to not do that. But I did want to respectfully disagree with you, Dennis, just on your position on the boycott. And instead of, I thought how I might best do that. And I thought the way I would just like to is to read a very short extract from a letter, open letter that was signed by a great many Israeli documentary film festivals, documentary filmmakers in 2025. I'm in the film industry, so I look at this from my lens when I'm looking at it.
Very short.
It is very short. As documentary filmmakers who have dedicated their lives to recording different aspects of reality in our country, and some of us especially to documenting the occupation, we are acutely aware of the importance of recognizing the truth as a first step toward changing reality. For this reason, we wholeheartedly support the global filmmakers boycott against us. So that's in the film industry context, but I just wanted to champion the very brave Israelis who are pro the boycott, and I would like to think if the roles were reversed, I would champion it if it was reversed towards South Africa as well. Thank you.
Basil over here, why did you take
try
this?
the other person. Try the other person.
Sorry?
Try the other person.
Okay, over there. Yeah. Yeah. Won't you pass this back, Linda? Pass this back.
Instructing me to move
Oh, go ahead.
A very short question. Mark made the point about the boycott, the academic boycott, and which was actually ignored. We all discussed the fact that all Israelis maybe shouldn't all be boycotting the same blanket boycott. But what he mentioned is that there is no other boycott at UCT but the boycott in Israel. What does that say?
Thank you. Do I have a lot? Do you want to go, Basil? Or
Okay, it's a different subject.
One more.
Let someone else go.
Thank you.
Actually, by fair disclosure, I might be the only foreigner. I'm actually an Israeli. The accent shows that I'm originally South African. Lived in Israel for many years and stuck here because of what's going on over there. Can't get back home, even though we're trying to. I'd like to just make one point, and I'm very wary of making this point, being a foreigner and coming from an outside environment. But when we look back on the era of apartheid, and we look to see, did the Jewish community stand up as you know what I want to say? Okay, right. So I think that I can say that having been on the on the so-called battle lines against what's going on in Israel for the last 4 or 5 years, and having my life turned upside down completely. And I'm not looking to be somebody who's a victim. Okay, I think that standing up and having the courage to turn around and say, as a Jew, I decry. I, as a Jew, decry what's going on in the West Bank, what's going on in Gaza, what's going on in Israel, if you in fact believe in it. And I believe where I come from, my Jewish values would cause me to decry what's happening. The ability to stand up and to stand up in this environment and to make that statement, okay, I say, first of all, kol hakavod to JDI for providing that platform to do that. And I think that people who believe that, sitting on the sidelines at this point in time, not a good thing. I think that people have to stand up and find that courage to make those statements, okay, whether they make them as representatives of X or Y or Z. And I think the fact that these statements will be heard by the wider community, non-Jew and Jew and Muslim, and outreach to other communities in terms of trying to engage them in that kind of discussion, I think that that's of extreme importance at this point in time.
Thank you. Well, shall we respond to that? Let's respond to those, and then I'll do one last round
because I've got a couple of indications.
Did you want us to respond?
Yeah. To any of those last you want to respond?
I just want to say,
Sorry.
Of course, I agree with you.
You're going to take.
So I've tried to argue all evening. I take my Judaism very serious. It is, of course, none of us are shaped by one component. If I say to my students when I teach them, I'm an aging white male Jew from South Africa, all of those shape my identity. But my identity is partly shaped by my Judaism. I spent years and years in Talmud. I still take the Jewish tradition incredibly seriously. For me, putting the Jewish tradition in its best possible light is absolutely means that you have to accord absolute equal dignity to every human being, notwithstanding their origins. And they transcend identity as a result of that. I watched, when I did a television program the other day, I said to the Palestinian and Jewish sort of interviewees, I have a simple philosophy about, I just don't want children killed. And it seems to me that you did right. I think there is a Jewish tradition that's worth saving. But the biggest existential threat to that tradition is the right wing in Israel today. And it's that's where I stand. So I want, we can debate one state or two states, that's not the point here. The point is to ensure, as I want, justice for Jews and justice for Palestinians. How we constitutionally work that out, that's a different matter. But that's my starting point. So I just wanted to say, I agree 100% with you, and I hope you get home soon.
I'll just comment on the Israeli filmmakers case. So during Feastman's fall, a group of students started grabbing out of the walls and they set it alight. And the quite well-known South African photographer, Mikhail Sabatsky, openly celebrated this and said this is a good thing. These students are fighting the good fight. And about a month later, in their frenzy, they ambled down to the law faculty and they saw all of these pictures Mikhail had shot in the Baltimore prison. And they said these pictures are racist and exploitation of the black body, they must be destroyed. And Mikhail said, I agree with these students, these pictures are racist and terrible and they must be destroyed. And I thought that's interesting. On its face it seems irrational, but actually it's very cynically irrational, is that you recognize that you are in a moment where the crowd has taken control. You have a manic episode and you think, if I'm to survive this, I better go in the direction of the crowd. And my guess is that those Israeli filmmakers say, you've got a whole bunch of Hollywood celebs who've signed this boycott. If we ever want to have a career, we better sign on to this thing or we're toast. So I don't believe for a second that they are sincere in that stuff. They would much rather.
Two more.
That's great.
You just condemned a whole bunch of Israeli filmmakers you don't even know.
I'm an Asian swimmer, what can I say?
Over there, yes, go ahead. Sorry, so we're going to take you and Basil if you want. And then we'll ask them to answer yours as well. And then we'll close.
Okay. Thank you. That was, and I mean this respectfully, but I think there was a lot of powerful stuff that came from both speakers. But I think it was, for me, deeply unsatisfying. Because I think, for two reasons. The first is that the discussion, I think, avoided some of the more difficult questions. So you gestured towards the fact that sometimes anti-Zionism or criticism of Israel can veer into anti-Semitism. And I think the discussion really needs to be when that happens, or when we can start to say, this ought to be sanctioned. And I appreciate, Mark, your respect of free speech, and we should allow anti-Semitism to be expressed. But this is the second part of what I felt was unsatisfying, is that the discussion felt quite detached from reality. The reality is that speech, conduct, events are being suppressed on the grounds that they are anti-Semitic, with the IHRA being invoked as the like principal reason for it to be classified as anti-Semitism. That is aside, I think the most unsatisfying thing for me in this debate was that there was a discussion about academic boycotts and academic freedom, but there was no engagement with the BDS guidelines in terms of when academics should be boycotted, when Israelis should be boycotted, what is normalization, what is anti-normalization. There's a lot of work that's been done that may not have been done in South Africa that does that difficult work of distinguishing, when do we give a platform to an Israeli who is vocally critical versus when do we actually boycott a particular Israeli academic institution, etc. So the detachment from reality and I think the detachment from facts, which is surprising given that both you are in the legal tradition, detachment from facts in that the UCT resolution doesn't speak about Israelis in general. It speaks about Israelis with official author affiliations with IDF institutions or the military establishment. Does that mean an Israeli who has gone through conscription? I think that's one interpretation, but I don't think that's a plausible interpretation of the resolution. So this kind of straw manning, I felt, was the most troublesome part of the discussion, and I hope that clarity can come at some point.
Thank you. Basil, do you want to?
Yeah, I'm taking this from another point of view. So firstly, I'm just quite surprised that you glibly accepted those numbers of Iranian deaths of 30 or 40,000. I don't know if they're verified. But anyway, this is my question, and it comes from a quote. And the quote is, "The token Jew functions as a fig leaf, concealing the ugly anti-Semitism that underpins much of the anti-Zionist movement. By elevating fringe Jewish voices, movements hostile to Jewish life and self-determination claim Jewish endorsement while dismissing the views of the vast majority of Jews as corrupted, brainwashed, or morally illegitimate. Being born Jewish doesn't excuse their bigotry, nor does it launder anyone else's hatred." So what I'm asking, and mainly Mark, is that an anti-Semitic statement in terms of casting Jews because of their views as being perhaps non-Jews or un-Jews, or as they say, token Jews?
Let me deal with both questions. I'll start with your first. Yeah, I'll start with your question first. So I think it's undoubtedly useful for organizations to bring out their pet Jew and say, "See, we're not an anti-Semitic organization. Megan Charles over here is a Jew, and she thinks that all Israelis are a bunch of genocideers. So, we're not anti-Semitic when we launch our campaign." I think having pet Jews around, you can parrot the talking points of the Ayatollah is very useful. As you would have had with every other country regime. So, for example, the apartheid government says, "We don't hate black people. Chat to these people who are running these Pakistanis. They seem very happy with the situation. And if you can use them to sort of push your pernicious elements." As I've said, I am in favor of quite a broad band of speech, and maybe even more so than Dennis. So I want, variety of views out there. I'm sort of going to limit speech at the point where it's genuine hate speech. On the point about the nuance in BDS directives, and we certainly don't see it in the UCT boycott. And UCT itself admits that it has absolutely no idea what kind of boycott it passed by council, because they have now sent out a survey to members of staff saying, "Please tell us what you think this thing means." What they have done when trying to implement this thing is ask people who were invited to a media conference, or media studies conference, "Did you ever serve in the IDF? Will you sign an affidavit?" So whoever sent that out seems to think that it's not about alter affiliations, that it's about service. So yeah, UCT basically rushed through I think sort of the basically close to midnight with a very small number of council members with pernicious motives. I think the reason why they wanted to change the definition was they figured that the Jerusalem Declaration would give them the room to institute the second part of their resolution, which is boycott. I don't think either of those things would allow it. And in that process of changing the definition, they breached their contract with the Donald Gordon Foundation Trust and lost the university not only 250 million rand, but also another hospital that would have been equivalent to something like Donald Gordon hospital that you have in Bits. So, and the person who signed that contract, Norman Arndt, is the chair of council. So one of the issues in the litigation is whether he should be personally held responsible for the loss of the university and the enormous amount of money that will continue to be bled out by the health sciences faculty. I mean, it may very well be the case that in 10 years we won't be able to sit in this auditorium because the university won't be able to fund it because of a group of people who've got a very, very pernicious, maybe only anti-Israel view, maybe anti-Semitic view.
You're giving the game away when you start quibbling about whether it's 20,000 or 30,000. I mean, frankly, there are a lot of independent agencies that suggest it was more than 30,000 people who died in Iran. And frankly, if you want to defend Iran as a sort of society which is a model for democracy, be my guess that then you and I are not going to be really having anything to say to each other. In relation to your earlier question, the second question, I do want to say something about it. I really don't mind. I made it absolutely clear that I'm perfectly happy for people to even say Israel's a colonial project, a racist project. That's fine with me. But I do find it curious, I have to admit, that when people sort of are trotted out and they're told they're Jewish, so my question is, what does their Judaism mean to them? Are they responding to this in any Jewish way? I find Israel's behavior utterly reprehensible from my deep commitment to a Jewish tradition. And by the way, my exemplar in relation to this is Stephen Friedman, because he's deeply learned in the Jewish tradition. He responds from it. It makes absolute sense. I am troubled by people, who essentially say, I'm Jewish, and I'm appalled by this as a human being with pleasure. I don't think the fact that you're Jewish makes it anything special. It does make it special, it seems to me, if you're taking a view like Friedman, you're saying, my Jewish reading, deep study of Judaism, makes me into a position that I find the present status quo an abomination. And I think there's a difference. And as for you, frankly, when I was listening to the question, I was thinking, were you in the same room as me? I'm sorry to be disrespectful, but I read out what the Jerusalem Declaration says. It tries as best as I've indicated at the beginning to give some guidance. You can't possibly, this is not something where you're going to put people in a lie detector test to determine whether they're anti-Semitic or not. These are difficult because I think both Mark and I, in different ways, are trying to reconcile freedom of expression with essentially a form of identity politics, which is immensely destructive for me. And so, when it comes to the question of the boycott at UCT, I was heavily involved in this because it's well known that I was trying to mediate between the two sides, came very close to actually getting a settlement, which I think would have been in the university's interest, but that's another matter. But it was clear that when we spoke about the one issue, leave aside the government's questions, which I'm not going to talk about now, which is before the court. But when it came to the question of the definition of the boycott, I was told consistently, no, we didn't mean all Israelis. But meanwhile, back at the Reich, all sorts of Israelis were being boycotted by UCT. There were all sorts of conferences to which every single Israeli academic was boycotted. So it was really, in a way, which was a blanket ban. When I was told it wasn't a blanket ban, I had a simple answer there. Well, let's sit down and then write a better definition so we know what we're talking about. And so, if you're dissatisfied with that, I'm dissatisfied with that too, because we haven't got there. But I'm absolutely clear about this, that is, as imperfect as the Jerusalem Declaration is, it's helpful to me. It's helpful to me because at least it says, if you're going to start saying, for example, that non-Israeli Jews are more loyal to Israel, generally, or they are held responsible for Israel because they're Jewish. I know where that's coming from. And if you say you're a Zionist because of that, I know that in fact there's something beyond that. But if you've come here expecting that I can give you a precise definition, I can't do that. What I know is this, that three things. One, that anti-Semitism is the longest hatred. It has been there throughout the vicissitudes of Jewish history, and I'm not naive enough to think it's just gone. It can't be used as a basis, secondly, to stultify what is obviously the kind of debate we should be having, and to some extent that we have, obviously. And I think finally, the point that I want to make is that, it's incredibly harmful to any kind of academic endeavor to paint people in that direction. Mark said to me the other day when we were talking that he was regarded as the big fascist and I was the smaller fascist because, quote, when you scratch any liberal Zionist, I didn't realize I was, but people said no, out comes fascism. And I thought to myself, let's leave aside the absurdity of calling me that. I just thought to myself, is that how we're going to debate? That we just use terms to basically nullify people? No, you didn't say that. I'm not talking about you. Don't be anxious about it. It's not about you. It's about, I'm just trying to grapple with the problem of, and may I say this, and it's not about, it's just triggered from your question. What I find astonishing is the way that the Jewish establishment wants to shut down free speech. Because minorities need speech more than anything else. Somebody asked about the protection of the Jewish community in South Africa. Shut down our freedom of speech, and then I know we're in total shit. Right? And frankly, what I'm trying to say is, how do we grapple with the dilemma of that there is anti-Semitism, that it's legitimate to basically criticize Israel, and of course, there's an overarching debate here, which we could have on a different occasion. Are Jews better off as a result of the state of Israel, or are they better off in secular democracies? Sure. It's a serious debate to have, and I'll leave it there.
I have to cut it off. No, I have to cut it off.
We have to clear the building at 9.
Simple question.
Well, the question was, sorry to say it again.
The question was, besides the pros and cons of this boycott, was why do universities like this city only have a boycott against one country and its army, which is in conflict right now?
Have we not addressed that?
I think we have, and I'll tell you why. Well, I'll tell you why. I think there's an overall problem that the world only has attention to one particular moral question at a time. Question, right? That's number one. Number two, the fact that some people within the university want to pursue a blanket boycott of all Israelis. I'm sorry, on the Jerusalem Declaration, that's crossed the line.
Okay, we're going to stop now.
We have to clear the building at 9.
We have to be out the building at 9. So let me say I did let this go on for long because I think it was an important discussion, and I hope you felt so too. I wanted to. If you want to participate in ongoing discussions of this sort, please subscribe to our newsletter on our website so you get informed about it, and we'll know when we have these discussions because there's lots to come, and Dennis has just challenged us for another. Finally, a big thanks to our speakers, particularly. Thank you all of you for joining us today. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Can you please take your cups, your bottles with you?